Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we have an author with us, Natasha Solomons, who has come all the way from England to be on our show, and I really appreciate it. I hope the travel didn't displease you.
No, it was fine, even though it was an 11-hour flight with a 1-year-old baby who was too excited to sleep.
Too excited. Oh, dear. Now, in addition to having the son, it's a son and he's 1 year old?
He's one.
And he's too excited to sleep. Oh, well. We'll keep you awake here, I hope.
Oh, I'm wide awake.
Okay. Natasha is both a novelist and a screenwriter. She lives in Dorset, England, and she has written this book, The Gallery of a Vanished Husband, which is her third novel. And it's a very interesting book, even in the different ways that one can approach it. For example, you can say of it, well, let's go to the very beginning, the opening passages, and it'll get you right into it. At that moment, you write, on her 30th birthday, Juliet, the main character, decided that she wanted something more than fridges, more even than paintings of girls reading in sunlight. Juliet Montague wanted to be seen. What's the thought behind that, wanting to be seen?
Well, Juliet is an aguna, so she's a chained woman that in Jewish law, only men are allowed to divorce women. And Juliet's husband has vanished 7 years earlier, so leaving her with 2 young children. And in her conservative community, this has left her rather on the fringes, where she's not really supposed to speak to other men, and she's been trying to be respectable, but living this rather sort of invisible, marginalised life. And then really at the age of 30, she's had enough, and she wants to be seen. She wants to be visible again. She's tired of living in black and white. She now wants to live in colour.
And one of the phrases that I think is in the book, it's like being married without being married. Well,
I think it's sort of being chained to a dead marriage where her husband has disappeared, but she's forbidden from moving on. She's not really supposed to have a boyfriend or to do anything else, and she's just stuck. And when the novel starts, she's just decided enough is enough.
One of the interesting things about that background to that character is that it is really part of your personal history.
Well, my husband, David, his grandmother, Rosie, was an aguna. She, in Glasgow in the 1940s and 50s, she brought up 2 young children in the Gorbals. And the Gorbals are a bit like sort of the projects in the US. And she was just determined that her children would have a better life. And she never divorced. Her husband disappeared, but she never managed to divorce him. And yet she was just determined that her children would have better things, and they did. Her son, my father-in-law, was the first in his family to go to university, and I'd heard all these stories about Rosie, this sort of really courageous woman, and I wanted a bit of her spark for Juliet.
I think it's very important to understand that, because Juliet's story seems a bit incredible if you were to sum it up, what all she accomplished from where she started. And to understand that has happened or is happening, probably still, in real life, so to speak, is, I think, important. The other thing is that while Juliet is wanting to move on, her parents are not. Her parents are saying, George is going to come back, and if he doesn't come back on his own, we'll hire detectives, which indeed they do, to find him.
And I think this is something that Juliet finds so difficult because she adores her parents. She's very close to them, but they don't really understand her. And Mrs. Green, her mother, finds that Juliet has ambition, which is something that's really a little unsavory and not quite respectable. And why can't she just be content to make the chicken soup and to stay at home and to maybe weed her garden? And Juliet she can't bear to do this. She wants more from her life. And yet she's conscious that her decisions do affect her parents and make things difficult for them in their community.
Mm-hmm. Right at the start, she makes a choice. It's absolutely fascinating. She's wandering around, or on a mission, actually, to buy a fridge.
Uh-huh.
And she decides she's not going to buy a fridge. She's going to have her portrait done.
Yep, she blows all her savings on a portrait of herself. And I think that goes back to her wanting to be seen. Finally, she's not going to be invisible anymore. She's going to have this portrait.
One of the things you say about her, or is said about her in the book, is that she really sees pictures. She really sees paintings. What do you have in mind with that?
I think she's somebody who has an eye. It's the sort of, I suppose now we'd say somebody who has an ear for music, where they can sort of hear a tune.
Well, that's fine. And it's a special ear, just as it could be for music, and they grasp something right away. Well, we have other things to talk about concerning the Gallery of Vanished Husbands, and we'll do just that when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
The Gallery of Vanished Husbands, a novel by Natasha Solomons. That's what we're talking about today. It's a Plume book published by one of the large publishing groups called Penguin, the Penguin Group. You know, interestingly enough, it seems to me that the title of your book was or is also the title of a column.
Yes.
Where they're trying to find these cats who ran away?
Yes, there still is a newspaper called the Jewish Daily Forward, a Yiddish newspaper. And for many decades, they ran a column called the Gallery of Vanished Husbands, which was like a rogues gallery, a sort of a lineup with photographs of these errant husbands. And underneath, a little sort of description of the families who'd been left and when they'd last been seen.
And were they ever successful? Did you have any sense of any success of that type of business?
Yeah, I think they were sort of, sometimes they did find the men, but I think this is one of the things I always sort of found so uncomfortable, is that there are these adverts for these men to return, and the women are supposed to want them back so that they can be delivered with a get, which is what Jewish women have to have in order to be properly divorced. But there's no suggestion that these women maybe don't want their husbands back. They'd maybe like some help so they can support their children, but really they'd be quite happy if the husband stayed gone and they were allowed to get on with things.
You can see the response, "I found you, now get lost." Yeah.
Oh, and I found you, give me my freedom so I can move on with my life. Now get lost.
Yeah. One of the marvelous accomplishments in this book from the writing side, in my opinion, is that you come up with phrases and sentences that are absolutely perfect. At one point in the book, she's going to or was already at, I forget which, a very, very fancy dinner party, which turns a little bacchanalian after a while. But here's the way you describe it. Juliet understood that Valerie is one of the painter's mothers.
Yeah.
Juliet understood that Valerie lived in a world of superlatives, where one felt things frightfully, desperately, and people were always dying for things. I mean, that's a perfect description of a stuck-up upper crust, isn't it?
I think it's just sort of the exaggerated way of talking, sort of, darling, I'm famished. These are people who sort of don't know the meaning of such words. And Juliet, who comes from a sort of a lower social class.
She sure does.
She's just terribly confused by these people. And she feels like an outsider in this sort of Jewish community that she's come from, this sort of conservative, sort of small town suburbia. She feels just as much or even more of an outsider in the sort of the more affluent and higher sort of social class. That when she goes to this country house, her young friend Charlie, it doesn't even occur to him to tell her that that the family has a butler and a housekeeper. She says, "Just your mother lives here." Well, yes, but with a staff. But he didn't think to mention that because of course there's a staff.
All of which made Juliet feel frightfully uncomfortable.
Yes, frightfully uncomfortable and terribly provincial.
Charlie is very important, though, to this story and to her.
Yes.
In the sense that instead of friezes, she decides to have her portrait painted by Charlie. And it turns out, I think, to be one of the best pieces he does in his entire career.
I think the best piece, which is rather heartbreaking for him because he does the painting when he's only 21 and he continues as a painter his whole life. And it's sort of when he's looking back at this painting as an older man, he realizes that he peaked too soon.
She brings the picture home and her son, Leonard,
yeah.
Leonard looks the thing over, and before you know it, he's disappeared. And the reason he's disappeared is he thinks he's found a way to find the father.
Yes, Leonard, who's 8, nearly 9 at the time, has added sort of 2 and 2 and got 75, and decides to go on a mission to find his father.
And he gets help nicely and gets sent. Actually, he comes back home with Charlie.
With Charlie, yes. And Charlie he's a really important figure. And sort of he rather fancies Juliet and thinks she's rather delightful. But Juliet she's an older woman. Juliet is 30 with 2 young children, and she's from a very different social sphere. Charlie grew up in this rather wonderful manor house with his mother Valerie and staff, and Juliet grew up in the suburbs in a sort of small Jewish community. And the fact that sort of Charlie doesn't quite understand how different they are just sort of says everything to Juliet. But really, as far as she's concerned, he's a boy, a lovely boy, but a boy.
I need you to talk a little bit about one of the aspects of structure in the book. Chapters in this book do not have numbers. Chapters have, at the opening of each chapter, they have a description of a catalog item. Catalog item 1, woman with a bowl of apples, parentheses, a.k.a. the fridge, parentheses. Charlie Fussell, or Fussell, Charlie Fussell, oil on canvas, then the size, and the year 1958. Now, each chapter begins that way with a catalog item. Explain the use of that.
Well, the novel is structured like a gallery catalogue, with each chapter hinged on a portrait of Juliet during every stage of her life. So each chapter features a portrait of Juliet by a particular artist in the book. And the earliest portrait is actually when she's painted when she's only 9, and the last in her 70s.
Is it not also the catalog that they're talking about here is the catalog that she's making up for the first show of the gallery? Or did I read that in?
No, not so much. This is actually the catalogue that her son Leonard will curate after Juliet's death.
Okay. One of the things Gallery of Missing Husbands does so well is it captures 60s London. And we'll show you how when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Natasha Solomons has been good enough to stop by today to talk with us about her third novel called The Gallery of Vanished Husbands. And I've been talking about how wonderful the writing is, and I want to share another snippet with you, and perhaps the author will comment. I don't know. After the police, this was George has just disappeared.
Yes.
And first, of course, you consult the police, and if you're in a conservative Jewish community, next come the rabbis. After the police came the two rabbis. They traipsed into Juliet's house with their long beards and sweeping black hats and perched side by side on the patterned sofa with the grimness of a pair of crows heralding bad news. Sandwiched between her parents, she struggled against an impossible urge to giggle. That is so dead on. I mean, you can just understand that, the urge to giggle, I think.
I think the sort of the awkwardness of the situation and the fact that Juliet knows she's supposed to be behaving, and also what's happened is so awful that somehow she can't help it. The most inappropriate thing to do is to laugh. And so it rises up in her like a sort of an inopportune burp. There it is.
Yeah. One of the things we like authors to do when they stop by is to read just a little bit from the book. And I think we've agreed on a passage early in the book, around page 20. Do you want to give us the background of that?
So Juliet has she's been saving up to buy a refrigerator with all her birthday money, and then at the last moment she blows all her savings on a portrait of herself. And her children, Leonard and Frida, are waiting at home for what they think is going to be a refrigerator to arrive. And then they're rather surprised when this packing crate arrives. Okay. Juliet hustled the children into the house, following in the wake of the delivery men. Vibrating with excitement, Leonard pattered into the living room as the men began to lever open the pallet. Frida lingered in the doorway, hands thrust deep in her pockets. "I thought you said your birthday present was going to be a fridge." Juliet flushed. "Yes, it was, but then, well, I decided that was really a rather horrid present for a birthday." Neither Frida nor Leonard spoke. They'd always thought that refrigerators were horribly dull, but believed them to be one of those things grown-ups termed an acquired taste. They were surprised but intrigued to discover they'd been right all along. As the delivery men finished prying open the package pallet, Juliet, Frida and Leonard stepped closer. "Oh," said Frida, "it's much better than a fridge." Leonard felt a sharp pang when he saw that the object inside the pallet was not in fact a television, and then a ripple of wonder. He knew somehow that his mother had done something unexpected, something marvellous, and something that Grandma would not approve of. He looked at the woman in the crate who was his mother but transformed into some familiar stranger. He turned back to Juliet, who stood behind him, head to one side as she surveyed her other self, and at that moment she was a stranger too. Kneeling, Juliet eased the portrait out of the box, and then, slipping out of her shoes, climbed onto the sideboard and hung it on the wall. "Is it straight?" "No," said Frida, "that side's lower. The left, no, the other left." Juliet jumped down and stood between her children. "Do you remember when another picture used to hang here?" Leonard shook his head. "I think so," said Frida. "It was a girl." "It was me." "It was me," thought Juliet, "and he stole me when he vanished."
That really gets to the heart of the book, the heart of the sorrow of George running off, and the beginning effort by the kids to come to grips with it.
Yeah.
No, it's a very good passage, well chosen.
Thank you. Yeah, I think they struggle, and Juliet has to try and fill the role of both parents, and yet try and balance that with her own ambition for a different life. And she tries to be a good mother, but I don't think she always manages. But I think that good mothers would make for terribly dull fiction.
The Gallery of Vanished Husbands does an outstanding job of taking the reader into the art scene at this period in London, which is what, the late 60s?
Starts off in the early 60s and sort of takes
60s.
us all the way through to almost the 70s.
Going on at the same time is a pretty wild pop culture scene.
Yeah.
Right? And I think you get close to that when Valerie in her fancy home, frighteningly fancy, throws a party, and it turns into a bit of a bacchanal.
It does. And I think that this is one of the things that sort of makes Juliet realize that how much of an outsider she is, because while she feels like an outsider in the conservative world where she grows up, she still feels like an outsider in this sort of more sort of swinging world. She feels terribly provincial, that she's been married, she's only slept with one man, and suddenly she's in this sort of world amongst these young students, and they make her feel, I think, a little bit of a prude, which I find quite endearing.
Well, the other thing is, at this swim party, she finally gets thrown in the pool, and she can't swim.
No, and she has to be sort of pulled out by another one of the artists, and it's Charlie again who sort of tugs her into the pool, I think, sort of hoping that she'll go swimming with him.
I wrote on my notes about the book that reading the last chapter of this book is one of the saddest pieces of business I've ever been involved in.
Oh my goodness!
Where you try to, sum it up, and the letter finally from George, powerful ending, but I thought very, very sad.
Oh, thank you. It's funny, I didn't find it sad in the sense that I think Juliet's had a wonderful and full life.
Mm-hmm. That's the thing to remember, isn't it? That through it all, she's had a great life. Well, we've been through most of it, but you can really get through it all. That is The Gallery of Vanished Husbands, a new novel by Natasha Solomons. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.